Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for supporting the African Composer interviews. We are actually recording this interview without streaming it to Facebook because we've had some technical challenges. But we thank anybody who's going to watch this afterwards, and thanks for your interest in following the live stream. The pity that we couldn't bring it to you live, but we are here with another African composer, our guest composer for today, who has agreed to do this interview with us. I'm going to allow her to introduce herself and to tell us everything she wants to tell us about herself. So it's quite an opportunity to meet another African composer. Thank you very much for giving us your time.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for doing this, because I was listening to some of the interviews today, and it's so interesting to hear people from all over the continent talk about what they do. This really is a wonderful project. So thank you, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you very much. That's really kind of you. Thank
you. So my name is Clare Loveday. I was born and raised in Johannesburg, South Africa. I've been here my whole life. I've never lived anywhere else. At one point, just before I started my PhD, I thought of going to do it overseas, but then I met my husband, and I wisely made the decision that he said he wasn't prepared to do a long distance relationship, and I had a little bit of brains, and I decided he was a keeper. So 20 years later, I'm still in Johannesburg. But I did my schooling here. I went to university here. I did my undergraduate at Wits University and my master's and my doctorate. So I'm very in the continent and very embedded in the country and very embedded in my city, which I love. Johannesburg is an extraordinary place, a vibrant, baffling, violent, intriguing, massively friendly, exuberant space. I think I would find it very hard to live quieter and calmer and less friendly. And a lot of my work I write reflecting on where I live, and I think a lot about context and what it means to be a composer living in Johannesburg. Never mind South Africa, never mind the African continent. These are all very complicated issues, I think, particularly those who are writing new music, which is a very European tradition, and trying to think to ourselves where we fit into this picture. I wouldn't have it any other way, by the way. I like living here and having those challenges. I find them interesting, and they push us to do and write better things. So more about myself. I did my doctorate on focusing on the classical saxophone. So I'm best known for two things: for writing for classical saxophone and for my interdisciplinary work. I have done a lot of work with the artist Nandipam Tambo, who's an extraordinary person and does the most beautiful work. And I've just done a season at the Centre for the Less Good Idea in Johannesburg, which is run by William Kentridge. And it's been a very wonderful and exciting process working with him. I mean, of course, I write for whoever asks me to. I'm also writing a piano piece at the moment, for example, but it's based on text written by a Kenyan woman about migrant women in Japan. So it's a text-based piece. And my big passion in life is to promote young women, not only young, to promote women composers, because I think it's a tough gig being a woman composer, and as particularly the young Black women in South Africa, I think it's even tougher for them. So I feel I'm in a position to go and shout at the relevant people, and that's what I do. I do a lot of shouting and a lot of kicking at glass ceilings and making myself unpopular, and I don't care, because I want that ceiling to be a little bit higher for the next generation. And I think, what else can I tell you? I think that's probably about it. I'm sure as the interview goes on, more things will come to light.
Yes. Thank you very much for that really interesting introduction to your background. And I mean, I found out more about you in the last few minutes of you talking, a few seconds of you talking, than I found out doing research online. So yes, I guess the internet needs to be updated. And that's kind of one of the thrusts of these interviews. You know, it's keeping up to date and it's recording our history accurately as Africans. Wow, you do quite a lot. You are very interested, and this comes across from what I've seen online about you. Very interested and keen on interdisciplinary work. I'm very involved with music across Africa, but I'm not a professional composer. I grew up singing and performing the works of African composers as part of choirs. Yeah. I will not say that interdisciplinary is quite well known, at least not where I am from. So I find it really peculiar, and I guess I'm going to jump to one of the questions I was supposed to ask later. Burning a piano on a beach in Australia. Can you tell us about the burning piano? Because I think that's part of what you mean by interdisciplinary. And then we'll talk about the car and the strings.
Okay. So the burning the beach in Australia, I mean, that was such a funny experience, because there is this piece that's about burning a piano, and it's obviously very theatrical, which is what makes it interdisciplinary. I mean, it's really a piece of theatre to watch this piano arriving and then being set alight. But it's also a visual, an auditory thing, because you hear the strings snapping. So there are these sounds and the wood crackling. And I mean, it is an extraordinary thing to watch and hear a piano being burnt. But what I immensely funny about the burning of the piano in Australia is, because of all the health and safety regulations, we weren't allowed to stand nearby. So they had this like wide perimeter with all these firemen in their gear. And I mean, this added to the theatre of it, not letting us. I wanted to like creep forward and listen to hear those piano strings going doing, you know, but we weren't allowed near. So that was a whole like other part of the theatre of the thing.
Yeah. And it seems like you said you found it amusing, but not everybody around you did, based on an article I saw online.
Sorry.
Well, yes.
Look, I'm assuming they didn't burn a like £1 million piano. I'm assuming it was a sort of real wreck. That's what I'm hoping. Yeah.
But you talked about perhaps the sounds emanating from the burning instrument. Is that part of what interdisciplinary music is about, or creations? Is that what they're about? I'm going to look at this one where we talk about your dramatic works. You did something called the Collision Project. It's an art installation, 2006. And it was a theater work, concert piece, art installation for car wreck and attached string parts. What is the? I'm going straight to the end of the interview now, because I thought she has so many interesting things to tell us. Let's just go straight into it. What is the drive to want to do something like this? Because people may hear on the car wreck. It's music.
Yeah, I know, and I think this is one of the things we were exploring in this project, because at the time I was working at the Wits School of Arts, and they were at Wits University, and they were promoting an interdisciplinary program. And I got together with someone from drama who worked in the drama department, but who's actually a fine artist, Gerard Marx. And we said, okay, let's do something as interdisciplinary as it can possibly be. And I said, for me, the thing is that you can't remove the object and the sound. The two are completely intertwined. Because while something like a ballet or a dance piece is possibly interdisciplinary, and play it apart, or like an opera that involves singing and an orchestra and acting, and you can still listen to the opera separately. So I said, I want to do something where the two cannot be separated. So I can't remember how we got to the idea of a car wreck. I think that was the artist. So he came up with this idea of a car wreck because it's a very emotive thing, a car wreck. You know, you see a car wreck and immediately you start to think, what happened? Did anybody die? Were there children in the car? And he found a station wagon, which is it's a family car, you know, it's you imagine children and, you know, toys and things in the back and maybe a few aunts scattered around, and you wonder what happened there. And then he made these, I thought it would be better to work with, you know, initially we thought of just extracting sounds from the car, but that's quite predictable. I mean, you can bang around on a car for an hour.
Okay.
Yeah. So where's the voice? We wanted the car to have a voice. So he made these amazing scrolls of string instruments out of metal and tail pieces, and we attached them to the car, which also sort of added to the sort of visual impact of the car, because these like scrolls on the top of the car looked like crows sitting on the car. And then we attached strings into places. Look at your face. Strings to the scrolls and to tail pieces at sort of resonant parts of the car, and then out how to draw sound out of these strings. It was the most extraordinary process. So I mean, obviously you can like play it with a bow or whatever, but if you attach a piece of dental floss to a piece of string and you put hiker's resin on your hands and you run your hands along the dental floss, it sounds harmonic sound coming from the strings. So it's like this disembodied voice emerging out of the car. So what we were thinking was we're going to tell the story of this car through sound, the emerging voice of this car. So it was about 50 minutes to an hour, and the performers started whispering softly, and we asked them to use their own home languages, so it didn't all sound like English, because, you know, English is a very essay language. So it was this kind of blend of sounds, and then gradually they kind of emerged out of the car, started stroking the car, tapping it, tapping the strings, doing this thing on the dental floss, and only at the end did they bow the strings. It was a sort of whole sound at the end. And, you know, what was so thrilling about that piece was the responses of people afterwards. I mean, people told me they heard the sounds of their siblings in the car. One woman said to me she heard the voices of her ancestors. Someone else said they heard beach sounds. I mean, it was just extraordinary. You know, you don't tell people what to listen for, and they bring their own ears and imaginations into that sound, or their own experiences. It was an amazing project that, of course, people said, oh, well, you know, you're writing for strings, why don't you just write a string quartet? Because this kind of thing has been done before, you know, like writing a string quartet has never been done before. But it was the most fascinating process. And it was also a teaching process because we used students. So for them, it was this wonderful learning experience. Yeah, thinking about how you make music and what a concert piece is, what it actually means. Yeah.
Right. Should I just take a guess and say that that's not a performance that you can easily repeat exactly the first way it happened, which is what happens with music usually. It's like a one-off premiere and that's it. Premiere to death.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would love to do something like do the Collision project in a completely different country. And because it's a very sort of graphic score, so it's very open to performers' interpretations. So it'd be the most amazing thing to do it in a completely different country with completely different performers and see what they bring into the piece and see what audiences somewhere else hear in this. Hear of the sounds coming out of the wreck.
It's interesting. It just occurred to me. Sorry, I didn't want to ask this question, but it's a very interesting direction we are going in. As an African, I'm not going to pretend to speak for the whole continent, but there seems to be and people try to sometimes keep as far away from death as possible. So it's interesting that you could get performers to actually touch that. And when we have funerals in Africa, in many parts of Africa, they can go on for days. We celebrate life, but we also want to be distant from death. I'm just intrigued to see that you could find an audience. What kind of audience was it?
Well, I suppose because it was at a university, it was a very sort of intellectual elite audience. It also attracted the art crowd, interestingly enough, the fine art crowd. And sometimes I wonder if the fine arts crowd isn't a little more curious than the music crowd. I mean, we certainly didn't have trouble filling the place. Yeah, that's interesting what you say. That's interesting. I didn't realize about the need to distance. I mean, I know about the long funerals because we have them in South Africa as well, but I didn't know about the distancing thing. That's very interesting.
Oh,
You
like
see, that
where?
could have a whole nother dimension. Oh, that
Yes,
could have.
yes.
Oh, yes.
Perhaps you'll compose in that around that angle. But yeah, where I come from, it's instant. People react instantly if you talk about death or anything, sickness, potential of dying. It's God
Okay.
forbid, oh no, no, no. Not
Okay.
everybody, but it's very noticeable. So I was
Yeah.
surprised that people actually agreed to physically touch something that could involve or evoke those kinds of memories. So that's very interesting.
Okay.
You are absolutely keen on interdisciplinary work, but you are also keen on participatory. I'm just wondering if somebody turns up to your concert, they should not expect to just sit back and enjoy the performance. Do you draw the audience in and get them to perform as well? How do you select your participants?
Oh no, I haven't done that. I wonder if something I wrote was misworded.
Oh no, I'm talking now about, like, for example, the car. There
Oh
was
no, that was just performers. I mean, drawing people in was to draw in their minds, not actually physically. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Did you always want to be a composer? Let's circle right back now to the very beginning. Always.
No. I mean, when I left school, truthfully, I couldn't do anything else except play music. I was useless at languages, useless at maths. So music was really the only option. But I think most of us, when we start off at university, we want to be performers. And that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a performer. I was interested in jazz, or as they called it then, light music. Isn't that absurd? Anyway, so I did a jazz degree with the idea of playing in theatre and doing that sort of thing. So that's where I started from. And for a long time, I was a pianist. I played on cruise ships and in theatre, yeah, and in theatre like musicals and that sort of thing. But I got a hand injury. And I was composing along the way because I worked in advertising for a while and I wrote jingles and that sort of thing. And then I got a hand injury and my playing had to stop. And it sort of coincided. I got a hand injury and I got divorced. And the two came quite close together. And I decided when I got divorced, I decided I needed to do something for me. It was not a happy time and I needed to do something to build my confidence. So I decided to do a master's in composition, which fitted in with the injured hands because, I realized I wasn't going to be able to play indefinitely. And that's actually how I got into composition, a series of mistakes. And the truth is I'm a much better composer than I was a pianist or could ever have been. So there was a big silver lining to that cloud.
Okay. I mean, I'm sorry to hear about the hand injury, but you are a successful composer, and I guess something positive. You've tried to pursue and get something positive going, carrying on from that. So well done. You really clearly must like music composition for you to have gone on to do a master's and a PhD. But I'm just wondering, you talked earlier about supporting people. Was it easy for you when you decided to become a composer? Do you know what year that was? What were the challenges? Did you face any ceilings or any blockers, so to speak, that tried to stop you?
Not at the beginning. I was still younger, and not at the beginning. I think there is support for young. I was talking particularly about women earlier. I think there is quite a lot of support for young women. But as time went on, and the better I got, the less support I got locally, which I find quite interesting. now most of my performances happen overseas, which is, I'm very fortunate, and I count my blessings that my works are performed by such extraordinary people, and that I have these wonderful performances and access to these incredible resources. But, home is home, Yes. We want to be heard at home. And also, local performers have there's something in them that people don't necessarily, there's a kind of grit there that I miss sometimes, not always, but sometimes in the performances elsewhere. But as I became more successful, I realized that age and success meant I really was smacking up against that glass ceiling. And for example, women tend to get the performances for smaller works, so a duet, maybe a trio, and the bigger works either get given to very young women who often really struggle because they haven't kind of got to grips with the techniques yet to do it in a way that reflects the best of them.
Okay.
But the big works tend to be, in South Africa anyway, commissioned to white men. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is, especially older white men. And I certainly experienced a very serious glass ceiling and got very, very frustrated by it, and decided that instead of just shouting at my poor husband about this, that I was going to do something about it for other women.
Okay.
Yeah.
And specifically the glass ceilings or the absence of support, these come in the form of not accepting your works for performances or not commissioning you, or how do these come?
Well, it works in quite a big way. It's not getting big commissions, not programming my works in big concerts. So I will have like a work programmed in a concert of light music. My music is not light. It really is not. But it'll be put in a program of sort of the light and frothy stuff. The best example I can give you is a British saxophonist friend of mine came out to South Africa and did a tour here and was playing a work of mine. And I went with her on the tour and took her around the country. And she said to me, "You are so badly treated by the men in your profession and you don't even notice." She said, when you give a seminar or give a talk, they don't listen, they don't engage, they don't ask you questions. When you go to their seminars, even if you're not enjoying it, you treat them with respect, you ask questions, you try to engage. She said they talk down to you, they don't take you seriously. And then about 6 months later, I went to England where she did some concerts of my work. And like big name composers would come and talk to me to be taken seriously. I was absolutely flummoxed. I barely knew what to say. I just stared at them with my mouth open, like a real hick from the colonies. And I thought, oh, this is what it is to be taken seriously. And then I was even angrier. So yeah, so I shout even louder for women.
Okay, we'll come on to that in a few minutes. I want to just talk about your instruments of choice that you like to compose for. We talked about piano earlier, saxophone. Are woodwind instruments and piano instruments your favorite instruments of choice to compose for?
I also like strings, I also like strings. I'm a little nervous of brass just because I haven't had that much experience of writing for them. Ditto percussion, but hey, I'd be open to it, The piano, I love writing for piano, but I find it a little bit tricky because it was my instrument. And I think when you sit down in front of your instrument, there's like a world of anxiety behind it. So in a way, I find it easier to write for instruments that are not piano because I feel freer, maybe. And I don't have a lot of experience of writing for voice, which I would be a one. I mean, I've written some choral pieces, but I mean, I'd love to write a chamber opera. That would just be amazing. Yeah.
This takes us, I guess, neatly or directly to the next question I was going to ask you. I've listened to a number of South African composers over the last few months since I started to do the work around African composers generally. And I was just wondering, having found out about your music and your compositions and people who compose around South Africa and the diversity there is in the kinds of works that are coming out, if South Africa represents itself in music accurately to the rest of the world or fully, you get performed outside of South Africa, yes. But when anybody speaks to anyone outside South Africa about South African composers or music, do you think it is your type of music they think about or a different kind of music? Because you mentioned voice just now. People are used to South African choirs and brilliant, beautiful singing, dancing and percussion. And yesterday I was wondering, who is representing this voice and does it really matter?
Well, as you say, the voice is so diverse. And I think that's what's one of the extraordinary things about being here. I mean, we have 11 official languages. That just gives you some idea of the diversity. When people think of South African music, I mean, I work in new music, which takes up about that much of the music scene in South Africa. I mean, choral music is huge, and the indigenous music, there must be dozens of different genres, not dozens, hundreds of different kinds of indigenous music genres being played and recorded. And I don't honestly think you can say this is the South African voice. I think the South African voice is so many things. It could be anything of 100, 200 things. Yeah, it makes it quite complicated.
That's really interesting. And that addresses some of what some of us observe outside of Africa. If you visit a country outside of Africa, there seems to be a way of summarizing the continent or summarizing South Africa. So when I say let's sing something from South Africa or let's have some music from South Africa, it may not be your style that will come up. It will be, oh, let's play the Lion King. Everybody sing and dance. Okay. So when they hear from you now, I guess it will be, I wasn't expecting that to come out of Africa. And I want to now raise a topic about African composers. So I created the African Composers Facebook page, and I asked someone to design a logo for me, which I then started to use on the page and on the website and everywhere. And then there's the comment somebody put online on the African Composers Facebook page after I put the logo up, and the person said something along the lines of, I would have expected to see more African instruments because the logo is just Africa in the middle with instruments surrounding it. And I thought, well, more African instruments. Now, there is a wider conversation around this where some people say African composers are composers who are from Africa. Some people say African composers are composers who compose in a particular way, the African style. What do you say?
I say this is an immensely complicated problem, and I am acutely aware of being a white composer in South Africa, and that's.
Oh, you're in South Africa, so that's.
Yes. As a white South African, it adds another layer of complexity. I don't know what the answer is, but I would suggest that any composer writing music from the continent or a composer who identifies as coming from the continent needs to be very, very, very aware, and I'm speaking from a white perspective, needs to be very aware of not using kind of cheap African tricks to make their music sound African, to sound African because that is where you come from, because it is a sound world that you have imbibed and absorbed and have thought about, as opposed to a style that you sellotape in with like little sticky bits, cut and paste little African features.
Yeah.
I think I'm probably reluctant to say that the two should be separated, that one should keep traditional instruments separately and traditional music separate, because cultures do move and evolve and don't stay frozen in a point in time. And that evolution is very necessary. And of course, it's happening. It's happening anyway. This is a very, very difficult issue. This is a very difficult issue, and it's one I worry about with every note I write.
Okay. That's interesting to see the effort that you're putting and the concern around that topic. I don't think enough attention is being paid to that topic, especially with respect to those who are outside of Africa who want to, I guess, show a kind of link or a connection, or saying, I've visited Africa, I know it well, and then they release some music and you think, oh. I was talking to a composer the other day, one of the composers that I interviewed, and he talked about how people just put this and that and they say it's African, and he said, well, what's African about that? And it's interesting to hear an African talk about how you have to be respectful, put in the time, put in the research, and don't just label everything and, as you said, sellotape a little bit here, a little bit there. So that's really, really interesting. I was a bit surprised by the comment on the logo, because I thought all instruments, African composer compose all instruments, but okay, if that's the feedback, then that's fine. I'll take that on board. And I'm just wondering, do you think that you don't compose using particular some instrument? You sort of restrain yourself because you are concerned about the kind of feedback you will get? You talked about who you are in terms of your demographic. I did not put something like that into the logo. I never thought about that when I asked him to do a logo for me. Do you think actually, because of my demographic, I will not do certain things? I will not create certain sounds. And is that how you see yourself making decisions?
No, not quite like that. I think the way I think of it is, if I'm going to work to create that certain sound, it needs to be absolutely authentic, and it needs to come authentically from me. Why do I want to make that sound? Who am I going to work with? How is that relationship going to work? Why am I using it? And I interrogate that a lot. If I'm going to create that kind of sound, why am I making it? And what am I doing it for? And what does it say about the world in which I inhabit? How is it reflecting my life as a composer in an African urban cosmopolitan city? Yeah, I think I don't think I would ever just make a sort of African-y sounding sound because I should. That really, I find, that really makes my skin crawl.
Okay. That's really interesting. That's really interesting, because I would have expected, I think, perhaps the opposite answer. So that's really, really interesting. You're both. And it's not just from you, actually. It seems to come across from composers. They don't just want to make sounds because they can. They want to put in the effort to make sure it's accurate, it's respectful. I don't seem to see this in other forms of music. People just put things online and say this is African this and African that. Are you sure, though? Have you asked the people from that country, told you that that's their sound? So that's really interesting. I want to just quickly talk about the glass ceilings you talked about earlier, and all the, what you do to promote and support other composers. It's also something I did not really find out from researching you. Perhaps I did not dig in that direction. But
because it's relatively new and I haven't put it up on my website yet. But yes.
Okay. Because I was going to ask about the support, any kind of support that you give to other composers. I typically ask this question during the interviews, even though not always, because I've met some successful composers and I wonder if they look back down the ladder and they think to themselves, I'm at a place now where I can help others. Can you tell us about what you are doing? We clearly know where the drive is coming from. Some people, when they are hurt like that or they are not served well, they become vengeful. Others become more helpful. So you've obviously taken the second route. Tell us what it entails, what you are doing to try to support others.
Well, the one thing I've done is I've started a South African women's music collective, which is for performers and composers. I started it out as a Facebook page to bring women together to talk about experiences, to support each other, to maybe draw on each other's resources, that sort of thing. But it's gone a little bit stagnant. I think a lot of people are going off Facebook now for obvious reasons. Now what I'm doing is I've found a sponsor to make a website of women composers and performers. A lot of other countries, like I've seen for England and Sweden and whatever, they have websites of women composers and performers, women in music, and it's a wonderful resource. And this is our next big project, is to get this website up and running, so that people from outside the country who are trying to access women particularly have somewhere to go. Okay. Yeah, so that's the one thing. The other thing is I've given, particularly at tertiary institutions that have a bit more clout and some resources, I've presented papers and about my experience as a woman composer, and done a fair amount of finger wagging and reprimanding that not enough is being done for women. We remain to see how much success that has. It's an ongoing fight. They're not immediate results, but yeah. So that's what I've done so far, which doesn't sound like a lot, but I'm hoping it'll build and grow. Yes. The one thing it has done, I've noticed, is it has brought women musicians together in a way that I think perhaps they hadn't been together before, and has given them a space to talk about some of the things that have happened to them, which I think is very, very important. Okay.
Okay. Some may disagree with, picking a particular group or a particular demographic to support, like for a gender-based one, like women only. But I guess you have your background and your history and reasons why you are doing this.
I have some Black composer friends who support Black composers, and this is all intersection. This all intersects, So my fight for women doesn't take away from my Black composer friends. They're fighting for Black composers. Basically, what we're all fighting for is fairer representation generally. We just pick our focus of fight.
Yes. Yeah. Interesting. So well done on that, and any work you do to support people. I guess we can find out about the Facebook page, and you maybe post something on the African Composers page, or send it to me so that I can share it with people, anyone who is interested.
Sure.
What have commissions been like for you, getting commissions? We're going back now to try to understand any struggles and difficulties you've had. Has it been really, really, can you give us examples of what you've seen in your space? Because I interviewed a composer recently who seemed to be able to get composers, I won't say easily, but he didn't talk about any difficulties getting getting commissions, sorry. And he's also in your country.
I don't want to ask the obvious question. My experience is that it's been really difficult to get commissions from institutions. It's people tend to commission me by getting together little bits and pieces. So one of the big commissions I got was partly funded by an institution from South Africa, partly funded by an institution from England. And they put together those funds. Another piece I'm writing at the moment is also being put together with little bits and pieces from this person, that person. One of the pieces I wrote was crowdfunded. No, it is hard to get commissions. I find it hard to get commissions. To be completely fair, a few years ago, I basically just gave up because I thought, what's the point? Every request that's put in is rejected. I suppose some institutions think I've had a good run and want to spread it around. I honestly don't know, but it's tough. It is tough. I think it's a little easier when you're younger because, there's something appealing about supporting a young composer, which is not a bad thing. That is not a bad thing. But it would be nice if your career could continue after the age of 45,
Okay. Now let's go a little bit deeper into your compositions. And I'm sure you are tired of answering this question, so I don't know how should we frame this. You want to compose a piece, or a large piece, a small piece, irrespective of size and length. Can you take us through the process?
Well, the first thing I do is I tend to find a brick wall and then I smash my head against it for about 6 weeks. Until the eyes. It takes, I mean, okay,
you don't have to tell us the process if you don't want. Silence.
No, I mean that's a little bit dramatic, but I mean it can be. I can find it sometimes can be very hard to get started because I've got to find my hook in. What is that little something special that's going to grab me, and then I just run with it. So it takes me quite a while to get started. So I'll sketch out ideas. I'll spend a lot of time sitting at the piano, just trying to pick out things, work out things. I think a lot. I spend a lot of time just thinking about the instruments, the kind of audience it'll be done in front of, the players particularly. I write very much for personalities. So the kind of person I'm writing for, what their strengths, sometimes what their strengths are, but sometimes I write against those strengths to see what I can bring out, can maybe take. I spent quite a lot of time imagining someone playing it and what it would look like and how they would play. And there's a I don't do electronic music because I love the physicality of acoustic music. So I think about the sort of body and what the body does, and I'm trying to find my way into that hook. And then once I've got the hook, then I look at then I start to play with it and elasticize it, and I just endlessly pull it out and pull it out. Then at some point I realize structure is a thing. So then I think about, okay, how am I going to structure this thing? And I don't write in the old like sonata form, theme and variation, those sort of things, although it might emerge, I don't know. That's not my job, that's the job of a musicologist. So and then I think of a sort of broad structure from intense to nothing, or I'm going to go from nothing to intense, or I'm going to work with textures, or I'm going to work just with register, or something like that. And then I play with that little hook and pull it out, and like kneading bread, until it's like pizza dough, these like long threads, to pull it out into this shape and play. And it's like being a kid in a toy box of endless toys. You just play and play and play and play with this hook because you've got a good hook. It's fascinating. It's endlessly fascinating. And that's the best part. That's when you sit for like 2-3 weeks and you're just immersed in this thing. It's just brilliant. That's the real joy, and working with performers. So that's my process.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you get immersed. It takes you some time to get your work finished, to do the thinking and everything else. And I suppose this means you will not appreciate interruptions then. For example, one we are facing now.
My poor husband is not allowed inside my studio, and I'm working, and I can see the top of his head coming around the door, and I think I'm not going to look because then he'll disturb me.
So how is the lockdown interrupting or affecting your process, if at all?
And no, it's affected it terribly. I just don't have space in my head. It's like my whole brain is occupied with processing this thing, this unfolding horror that, well, I hope it's not going to be a horror. I really hope it isn't. Because, in developing countries, the horror could be beyond imagining, and my whole brain seems to be taken up with that. I'm hoping it'll pass, and then I can get back to writing music. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And how do you think that, let's talk about pre-coronavirus, how do you think that societal interruptions as well affect composers where you live? Because we're talking about an African country, as with most countries around the world, we know about the challenges. It's the power supply, for example, supply of water, food, security. We know about these challenges. We know about the positives, but we know about the challenges as well.
Yeah.
Do these also impact your process in any way?
Yes, I mean, I think to write music in this country, well, I think not in this country, I mean, in a country like this, requires an extraordinary amount of self-discipline, because you have to almost, once you've absorbed what's coming in from it's a dichotomy, because I need what's happening around me to stimulate me and to have something to kind of kick against. And then the thing is to absorb that and then know when to cut it off, so that you can just focus your brain on what you have to do. But it is very challenging. As you say, power supplies, you know, the extreme violent crime of a place like Johannesburg, it is a challenge. It is a challenge, because a lot of your head is taken up with just like every time you step out of the front door, dealing with what you have to deal with every time you step out of the front door. Yeah, I think it is hard. Having said that, I have never managed to write music outside of Johannesburg.
Okay. All right. It's good to hear about from someone who actually lives there and how they get inspired and some of the challenges that they face because of the challenges around them, societal challenges. And I guess this is where, as part of what you already do to help other composers, if composers do find themselves in positions where they can influence decision, perhaps they might want to talk about how if the governments or those in authority can modify certain things to make the society a little bit more livable for people, they might get more people producing works and composing more. I think because we see that with those who, for example, step out of Africa, they suddenly start to produce more, not just in composition, in every sphere. And people start to ask, what's the difference? Well, it's the environmental factors and how you can support people. Talking about, people's heads being filled with less stress about what's happening around them, then they can sit down to imagine. But it's a good thing that you carry on, somehow you let these stresses help you produce something. So your works have been performed around the world: London, Birmingham in the United Kingdom, Johannesburg in South Africa, in Zagreb in Croatia, in Dresden in Germany. You mentioned this word earlier, success. But what for you is the definition of success as a composer?
Oh, I've never been asked that question before. I think the definition of success is to be able to write a work that engages with your performers in a way that challenges them, but also satisfies them, gives them something to bite into, to be able to write for good performers in a way that is challenging and creatively satisfying for them, that gives you that thrill when you hear it being played live. Because I remember when I was a young composer, hearing things played live and just thinking, oh, that was so bad. In a way that you think, I did that. But also something that what you write for gives an audience a hook in, so that they can think about music in a different way, hear something of themselves inside it, maybe challenge them a little bit, tickle something, And I think also success as a composer is never to be complacent. Paul Hanmer, who's a wonderful jazz pianist and composer, once said to me, we compose in order to remain humble. And I think that's a big thing. A successful composer is a composer who's constantly trying to move forward, who's not sort of sitting in a complacence, in a space where they feel comfortable, but he's constantly trying to push what they do, push out at the edges of what they do. That was just sucked out of my thumb. I have no idea if I would agree with what I just said tomorrow, but there you go.
That's good. No, it's really good to hear you talk about what you think at the moment the definition of success for a composer is. And as you said, it might change, by tomorrow, but it's good to hear that, because mentioned where you've been performed, different continents. And I guess what some might be expecting to hear is, oh yeah, being performed in different continents is brilliant and that's success, or being commissioned many times a year.
No,
Okay.
no, I don't think so. I think being performed in your own country is very, very special and very, very important, I think.
Okay. Speaking of humility and pride, do you have any works that you are especially proud you composed?
I'm very proud of my third saxophone octet. I think that's a really lovely work. I also really like my second piano etude, Johannesburg Etude 2. I think that's a work that's a meaty work, and what I like about it is it brings my jazz background, and it's not a jazzy work, but you can hear some Chick Corea under there, and a bit of Ravel. I love that work. And I think the work I did with Nandipa Ntambo, City Deep, that I wrote for baritone, saxophone, and clarinet, I like that work very much as well. I think that's a work that's got real depth to it. The performers tell me every time they play it, they find something new, and they must have played it, 20 times now. That, to me, is a sign of a good piece.
Speaking of City Deep, you are trying to capture the Africa around you, your immediate surroundings. By the way, I just want to point out, you talked about the Johannesburg Etude, I think you called it. This is something else. This is just me observing this outside of Africa, that people tend to label things using the word Africa. And I'm not going back to what I said earlier. This is actually people labeling works and just saying African this, African that. And you think, I noticed that with Africans, they tend to be a lot more respectful when they use the word Africa. You didn't say African Etude. You didn't say South African Etude. People in Africa tend to be more respectful, more specific. I just wanted to put that up because
I think people who live on the continent understand that we are not one homogenous group of people all doing exactly the same thing and living in exactly the same way. That this is the most phenomenally diverse place.
Yes.
I mean, to say African is simply, well, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense to me, but there we go.
Okay, brilliant. Now, we're talking about capturing the Africa of today. And City Deep, I read about very quickly before the interview, looked at it yesterday, and looked at your interview around it. Do you think that African composers today are doing enough to capture the Africa of today in music?
I think some of them are. I certainly think some of them are. I think some of them are not. But yeah, I think some of them are. I mean, I think of composers like Justinian Tamasuza in Uganda. I think his music is astonishing. Andile Khumalo here in South Africa is amazing because he comes from the global north. He was trained, he got his PhD from Columbia. I mean, he's highly, highly trained, but the more time he spends in South Africa, the more I hear South Africa in his music, just embedded underneath there. I think some are, and then at the same time, I think some aren't, because it's hard. It's hard.
I've spoken to some composers about perhaps looking at societal issues and composing, and what came across from them was that African composers, according to them, or the countries they come from, they write to be performed. They know where the works will be performed. So if you're writing something to complain about a war or famine or fatigue, internally displaced people, will it be performed? Who is going to perform the work? So I was talking to composers that compose mainly for church religious performances, and they said, well, yes, we generally tend to compose what will be performed. We know the choirs, we know exactly who is going to receive it and sing it. So I guess when you say it's hard, that also feeds into the challenges of composing for these kinds of subjects. But it would be, I think, brilliant as more, I guess, if more and more go in the direction of looking at things like City Deep and looking at your city and the building and the historical purposes and all of that around the building. But listen, each person must do what works for them. And that's something else a composer has told me. It's what comes from the composer. I guess it cannot be dictated to a person what they write about. Let's look at you now and your current plans. Do you have any ongoing projects that you would like to talk to us about, the ones that have not necessarily been interrupted by the stay-at-home directive?
Oh, well, I've got a harpsichord piece being premiered in August, which I wrote before the virus. That's a real challenge. I mean, how do you give a harpsichord a 21st century voice? And I really struggled to find that.
Do you
but I
want
got
to,
it.
do you
Sorry.
want to, you said, how do you give it the 21st century voice? Is that because you're a composer who fits into that space? Because a harpsichord is quite a historical, so to speak, instrument.
No, it is. And I mean, I listened and listened and listened to harpsichord music and, watched videos of it being played. And I thought, this is such a European instrument and it is designed for the European spaces. How can I think about this in this space? It took me ages, but I got there. And I think I've written a kick-ass piece. It's just wild, quite wild. So that will be premiered in August, and I'm very excited about that. And also it'll be premiered here because I wrote it for a young African harpsichordist, which I'm delighted about. So it'll be performed in South Africa, and that feels really good. The other thing I've been working on, which will actually be streamed, although it wasn't really my competition, it was very collaborative, a very interdisciplinary work, was part of this season at the Center for the Less Good Idea, and they're going to be streaming the work I did with some other people around a Kafka story, and I'm excited about that. It's very different. It's very different, and it was a lot of fun. And I played the cello for the first time in 30 years, which was a challenge, and it probably didn't sound very good, but I think the project speaks quite a lot. And then this piano piece, which I'm trying to write, but this lockdown and other things have just kind of got in the way. I'll get to it eventually. That's a very exciting project.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Well done. We are nearing the end of the interview. I just want to quickly ask you now more broadly about Africa and you reaching across beyond South Africa, because you're doing a lot of work within South Africa and even outside of Africa and supporting composers. And I'm always keen to hear about composers who try to reach beyond and say, well, actually, I'm going to go into East Africa now. I'm going to try to collaborate there on what they're doing and perhaps give feedback as someone who's got more experience. Do you think along those lines, the continent as a whole and perhaps your place as far as history is concerned and supporting and influencing others in some way, what do you think along those lines?
Yes, I mean, I'm probably a bit stupid here to think like this, but I feel a bit shy as a white South African to sort of go barging up into the rest of Africa, demanding attention, and it feels a bit colonial. I'm probably stupid, and I realize that this is like probably a silly hang-up. When I met and worked with other African composers, it has been amazing.
Okay.
And I've loved it. It's been such an eye-opener and such an incredible learning experience. And to hear how people talk about music differently, but it's still the same language, it has been amazing. I have a dream to go to Kampala because I know some composers there. So I have a dream to go to Kampala and drink beautiful Ugandan coffee and tea and go and play with my music friends in Kampala. So, yeah.
Well, that's interesting to hear that. I don't know about it being stupid. No, I will not agree with that. But then, of course, you said you're not sure. I would not agree with that. And I don't know about it perhaps coming from a colonial space. But I guess each person sees themselves differently. I'm not sitting in your skin, so I cannot speak about that.
I think from my perspective, I have seen quite a lot of white people going forth with with this kind of armor of extraordinary confidence and going to teach, and I'm very, if I'm going to do it, I need to do it knowing exactly why I'm going, what I'm going for, and being very, very careful about not my motives, but to be respectful.
Okay.
Yeah, about my approach. Yeah.
Oh. Right. That's quite interesting. I would have said something again, where as an African, maybe I'm just thinking too much in that space, but I would have said something completely different. Like, well, I'm an African, so I'm going to do this. I think much of the gripe about what you've described comes from people not appreciating it coming from the outside. So they would expect you to tell the outsider, excuse me, don't come and tell me what as an African, and your approach is not right. But hey, it's each person sits in it. Sorry?
I do that too. Tell people who come here, no, don't you dare come and tell us how to do things.
Yeah, well, I did ask someone recently, I thought, why is it that we all seem to sit here and wait for people to come, and why is it that people always come in to teach us? Have we never asked ourselves this question? We have things to teach you. Maybe you want to come and take a class, but it's not about the skin color, it's about the difference in culture and tribes and history. Exactly. We have things to teach in our own musical forms that you might want to listen to and learn. And then we can put things online to say we are teaching everybody as well. But we can go on and on about the last point that was unexpectedly made in this talk.
This is an hour's discussion all in itself.
On its on its own. But feel free. Listen, I'm not here to give you permission. You know what to do. You're an African. So I was going to say feel free to do, because I contacted you. I didn't wait for permission from anybody, because when you're an African, that's what you are. You own your continent. You don't wait for permission. But it's been quite interesting talking to you today, finding out about you, finding out more than what the internet says, in terms of articles and recordings. It's been good to get to know you. Thanks for your time. We weren't able to stream this live, but as soon as the recording ends, I will do what I can to quickly upload this to Facebook and to explain to those who were waiting what happened and why things were done in this way. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much again. And we look forward to hearing more from you.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been a wonderful hour.
Thank you. Thank you too. All right.
Okay. Bye. Bye.